Welcome, everyone. My name is Victor Monga. I am serving as board member of ISAC Orange County Chapter, CSA Los Angeles Chapter, and Virtue Testing Foundation. Today, we have an excellent panelist lined up. With us, we have security leaders and serving board members of each community to discuss NDR, EDR solutions. The cybersecurity world does not lack for acronyms, whether it's protocols or vendor solutions. This market is dominated by an endless array of capital letters. Cybersecurity draws in many aspects from military concepts used to combat aggressors on the battlefields. As an example of military concept, transferred to digital area by Lockheed Martin, as we all know, cybersecurity kill chain. Another good example is SOC Visibility Triad by Gartner. The SOC Triad is inspired by the nuclear triad, a concept invented during the Cold War. While this nuclear triad has never been tested, thankfully, the SOC Visibility Triad has undergone multiple tests and fulfilled its original purpose: to reduce the likelihood that an attacker will be able to achieve his or her goals. In today's episode, we will discuss some of these concepts. So why don't we start with a quick introduction and your understanding or familiarity with NDR, EDR space. Maybe we'll start with you.
Hi, so I'm Nemi George, VP for IT and Information Security at Pacific Dental Services. The NDR and NTA space, and you can lump in EDR there, I think has become a big area of focus over the last maybe sort of 5 years, and rightly so, because prior to this industry standing up, there's been a lot of focus on identification and also detection of anomalies, malware, threats across our network. And I think we kind of got inundated as security professionals with so many tools identifying problems, so many tools passing through logs and telling us things after the fact, and very little in the way of response. So I think the industry has generally moved to a more proactive, a more preventive state of having the ability to respond in addition to being able to detect things across a network. And that's really the background for why we have the NDR, EDR, XDR space that we're kind of talking about today.
Yeah, this DR never ends, right? NDR, EDR, TDR, XDR, MDR. There's so many DR. So, Jake, why don't we take your introductions and give us your understanding of this space, please?
Hi, Jake Margolis, the Chief Information Security Officer for the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. We're the largest water wholesaler in the United States and the largest water utility in the United States, for that matter. And we service 19 million residents in Southern California through our municipal agency partnerships. So these concepts are pretty important to me because we've seen the recent news and we've seen that water utilities are now kind of coming into the crosshairs of adversaries. Surprised it's taken this long for that to come around, to be honest with you, but it's good that we are more prepared with the technologies we have at hand today to respond to that. And that's kind of the crux of this. Is in my previous gig, where I was the CISO for the County of Orange, is my first exposure to these technologies. But we kind of looked at them as like technologies by a different name. Because we're always also, you say we use a lot of three-letter acronyms or a lot of acronyms, a lot of capital letters in security when you introduce the topic. And that's true, we do. Because we're always also trying to provide context so that people can do strategic planning and understand how to do a technology stack that arrays to their objectives. And I think it's important to say that when we see a name change from what they used to call EDR products, at once upon a time, there was this brief point in history where it was advanced threat protection, and then it became EDR, ATP with EDR, but they're all kind of the same thing. And EDR takes ATP to the next level, which is why we just kind of go with EDR now. Whatever that detection response is the important part of that acronym. And when we look at that, it is, and I agree with the previous statement, that we're expecting things to kind of run a little bit on autopilot given the nature of threat. We want things to respond. and handle some basic things quickly. Like if you see remote code execution being executed against a vulnerability or on a web server or something externally facing, you want something that can respond to that quickly, because by the time you find out about it, or by the time the SOC alerts you, some damage might already be done. So these tools are very helpful. And I think whether you're talking about NDR or EDR, they serve an essential function in your first line defense. And it does provide a lot more context when you're doing your forensic investigation as well, because you can kind of go back and replay events and take a look at what was actually going on, which really kind of helps you not spend as much time trying to solve or root through false positives versus false negative events that you used to have to do traditionally. And I think those of us that are on the panel remember how painful that used to be in the days before you had some of these more sophisticated tools that we have now. So from that perspective, I think the technologies are only getting better. And again, my first foray into them was just seeing how effective they were at stopping recompiled versions of malware that basically then get reintroduced to 0 days. And they still block it because of the functionality of the code itself and recognizing that that's malicious code, long before some of these other capabilities that exist today out there. So it's an impressive technology stack.
And that's the key, right? Detection and response. No matter what letter comes before it, I think detection and response is what the key is. Q, why don't we do a quick introduction of yours and familiarity with this space, please?
So hello, everyone. My name is Quincy Collins. I'm a Chief Security Officer for Shepard, Mullen, Richter, and Hampton. We are a global law firm based out of Los Angeles, California. So there are no shortage to threats that are coming our way or any other large, medium, or small-sized organization. Attackers are becoming more advanced. They're essentially small corporations rather than the lone wolf hackers that we think that they are or think that they would be. These folks are organized. They have different departments. They even have departments that collect payments. And folks on the blue team, security operators and companies are charged with protecting their environment. And we need advanced tooling and technology to keep up with the number of threats and the velocity of threats that could occur in our environment. So, enter network detection and response. And this I call it fancy snort, right? Where we're essentially back in 2010 and before, creating rules manually to take a look at the different network based threats that we had in our environment. And you had to have a certain level of understanding of the networking environment that you're trying to protect and the threats that are occurring, and essentially create your own signature. So network detection and response actually aids you in quickly having the ability to block things from a network-based, or threats from a network-based threat perspective, and block it with relative surety that you're blocking bad traffic. Additionally, it gives you some good visibility on what is actually going on in your network. Is this traffic anomalous? Have we seen this type of traffic before from these devices to these distant end IP addresses, for example, or to these different enclaves? If you have that visibility within your environment for traffic within, let's say east-west traffic rather than north-south. And then moving on to EDR, the industry has taken huge leaps with regard to endpoint technology and endpoint detection and response. And now we are able to not only stop signature-based threats, but heuristic-based threats as well, which is very important because, as Jake had mentioned previously, these threats are changing. They can change the hash, change the white space inside an executable, and make a completely different program from a hash perspective anyways, and essentially evade legacy antivirus. So we need advanced technology in EDR, NDR, and XDR in order to push ourselves forward. Now, these three-letter acronyms are essentially, they're definitions, right? But we have had forms of these technologies before, but they were just manual and they weren't as advanced as they are today. So I think security leaders need to, really pay close attention to what exactly you're getting and, move accordingly.
Nimi, during your introduction, you started talking about the background of NDR and NTA. So why don't we keep pulling that thread and give us a little bit more introduction on our description about the background on the NTA, NDR, EDR technologies?
Yeah, I think the real sort of genesis for this was people looking at solutions such as SIM solutions or other log aggregation solutions that were in place. And for the most part, a lot of organizations put these in as security tools, but for the most part, they're really used as compliance tools. They're used to aggregate logs. They're used because you have to comply or you're covered by various regulations that require, in some cases quite explicitly, that you have some type of log aggregation solution or the ability to have logs of the devices stored on in an environment other than the device for which the logs are being collected, which makes sense. But what we have found over the years is that a lot of these legacy technologies have failed to act in a proactive manner. They failed to put us on the front foot. They failed in their ability to be preventive in such a way that we are able to use them to actively fight and defend our organizations. And they excel for the most part as forensic tools, as major incident investigation tools, and so on. And there was a big shift to moving to tools that gave us that ability to track flow data across the network, to look at logs, to see things in real time as they were happening, and the ability to make decisions in real time. And so along came sort of NTA, which was, as the name suggested, network traffic analytics. It was really focused on the network at the time. And most solutions were set up to simply mirror the traffic, span port taps on your core switch, across your estate. And that's all it did. It gave you visibility. And then people kind of said, well, this is great. We're seeing things in real time, a little bit better than we were seeing some of the other tools that we had. But wouldn't it be great if we're able to respond? Wouldn't it be great if we could really take advantage of the speed of detection with the speed of response, which if you simply had a traditional NTA tool, you're still relying on your analyst, the human in the chain, to be at their station, so to speak, hands on keyboard, eyes on glass, responding to those alerts. And so NTA kind of morphed into the NDR space. So now you have the holy grail of detection and response added in. And then it kind of went on beyond the network, right? In certainly most organizations, the introduction of SD-WAN a few years ago meant that organizations started slowly but surely losing that single choke point within the data center or their on-prem comms room where you could put a physical NDR appliance. The rise of SaaS applications, the rise of cloud-based applications, remote working applications, bypassing VPNs or eliminating VPNs altogether meant that NDR solutions needed to themselves evolve into having cloud connectors into Office 365 or other email solutions, connected into AWS and all the various cloud vendors, including collaboration solutions out there, to give you that holistic view of all the traffic going across your estate, from end users to applications and also the network. And so that's kind of where the NDR space is now. It just is that ability to just give you visibility into everything that's going on, whether or not it's on your core traditional perimeter network or even if you extend beyond your core network.
Jake, what was your approach when you heard of these buzzwords, NDR, EDR, XDR, if you will, technologies coming out in the market? Did you feel that this is another hype cycle?
Well, there's kind of always going to be the hype cycle a little bit, but they also serve an essential, but I don't want to talk negatively of those because they do serve an essential function in our cybersecurity ecosystem, because how else do you become aware of what technologies are out there? I mean, you're always actively seeking the ability to actively detect, analyze, and respond to threats, right, that are coming to your network or to your endpoints or your devices or users in general. So I would say I don't just look at these as, this is the terminology we're using. The terminology is fairly descriptive for what these technologies do, which is somewhat encouraging because, like I said, it does make it easier when you're trying to do some strategic planning or when you're talking to people that aren't in the know. And detection and response is actually somewhat self-explanatory, which makes it easier. But my approach to these technologies is always a little skeptical at first with any technology because, when you talk to the people representing them, oftentimes this will solve all of your problems X. You have this problem, we solve that. You have this problem, we solve that. So you have to be a little bit curious to dig into them and see what it is they actually do for you. I will say that when I looked at them, I was really impressed by some of the NDR solutions that I looked at and their ability to automatically quarantine traffic, to automatically do things that, as stated previously, were very difficult, or not difficult, but at least time consuming and required somebody to be kind of looking at that and analyzing it. And even when you have the great question of, well, what happens when the system gets it wrong? Well, what I like about these NDR, EDR platforms that I've had experience in working with is they tend to err on the side of caution, meaning that they're going to block something on that rather than let it go. So they're never going to say, well, I don't know if this is negative traffic. So since I don't know, I'm going to let it go. Now, if it doesn't know what it is, whatever it's dealing with, it just blocks it. It blocks the execution. It blocks the transit. And I can deal with that because if I have to apologize to an employee and said, hey, I'm really sorry that your application didn't work. I know you have a report to run. We'll go ahead and add that application to our list, our whitelist within the tenant, and it will work the next time you run it. You may have to reboot your machine on and on. And that's kind of what I took on when I looked at this. This is great because you can sleep a little bit better at night knowing that if somebody's eyes are not on glass looking at something, that there is a technology that is going to take that initial detection. If it's not sure what to do with it, it's going to take some sort of positive action to protect the enterprise. Going into the EDR world, these technologies have been literally lifesavers for the enterprise when people started going home with COVID-19. In response, when we started sending people home because of our response to the COVID-19 pandemic, we had to have a way, to have users be autonomous within their home networks and being able to get the resources that they need. And we didn't want to continually bog down, traditional VPN connections with users having to come back to the network. In some instances you do, but these tools actually give you a little bit more flexibility where you could say, I might be able to do a split tunnel, or I may not be able to do a split tunnel. But if they're running this application, this EDR, I might be able to take that additional risk because there is something that's always looking out for the endpoint, whether that endpoint is on my premises or if it's sitting in somebody's home, which does provide an added level of protection. We always had that protection with the traditional antivirus because they had the virus definitions loaded into their local client, but it wasn't as effective. And if there was, and depending on how you had your antivirus update set up, et cetera, they may not get an update in time if there is something that comes out. But with these EDR platforms, they're a lot more responsive. They do a lot more to detect remote, or not remote, but well, actually I've seen them detect RCE attempts too, but to detect that execution of malicious code, which really makes the workstation no longer this kind of low-hanging fruit for an attacker, because that's that's the thing that they're looking for, is to say, well, I'm going to phish your end user, and then I'm going to run this application on your machine. Okay. This kind of addresses that concern a little bit, because if the user is phished and the application does try to run, these tools will typically block this. And, I've worked with some pen testing teams and talked to them, and they don't like going up against them because they're very difficult capabilities to work around. So I would say, I didn't want to make it sound like that it was a buzzword thing. I looked at it as, well, what does this actually mean? And so when you kind of start peeling back and you see what you get for a detection and response tool, there's a lot of value there for an enterprise. And, as I said in a previous podcast we had, if you remember, he was asked, well, if you had, what's better, NDR or EDR, what would you go for? To me, if you could afford both, do both. But I think it really depends on your network posture and how things are laid out, how you would go about investing in those technologies. But I would say nowadays, you definitely want to look at an EDR type platform for your enterprise, because people aren't coming back from this hybrid workforce. We're going to be in some state of permanent remote work, it looks like, for a really long time for most organizations.
COVID-19 had changed the landscape completely, and these platform solutions technologies are lifesavers for a lot of organizations. Because do you think NDR, EDR products are mature enough to solve unknown anomalies?
Yes and no. I think if you ask any information security professional, does this tool solve for X? It's like, well, it kind of depends. So, we're in a state now where, we have new threats every single day, and we have threats that exist that we don't even know about. Threats that work, that have been POC'd in, X environment in X country. And now, these anomalous attacks or these 0-day attacks can occur, essentially, without individuals knowing, unless you have a good EDR or EDR and NDR platform. Now, are they mature enough to solve unknown anomalies? Sometimes, yes. Sometimes these tools and technologies get it right. And then other times, the activity that occurs on an endpoint or within a network, looks to be, they kind of come in with the other sheep, right? A packet looks like a packet sometimes. And, these products aren't able to distinguish friend from foe, good from bad. So, for the most part, I think NDR and EDR platforms, are able to do a good job at understanding what these attack vectors are, but sometimes they miss the boat. So, you take a look at some of the larger, more important or more significant 0-day attacks that occurred out there. These attacks occurred on enterprise networks from large government organizations to, very, very well outfitted corporate environments to large technology providers. And these attacks were successful for a time until, a tool picked it up, or a person might have been doing some threat hunting and picked it up. So, they are able to solve for, these 0-day exploits and attacks and very anomalous, find anomalous behavior, but they're never really going to be 100%, because network traffic, services on a PC or on a Mac or what have you, a lot of these things, can occur, and the systems that are charged to, understand the behavior, whether it be from the endpoint or from the network or even in a cloud, it looks to be like anything else. So, what we're really getting at here is the security of your environment depends upon ultimately the decisions that you've made previously and the decisions that all of your users and, your technology folks make each and every single day. So I think NDR and EDR products are on top and kind of can get you that extra, let's say 3 to 5%. But, we're looking at 95% of your if we look at an iceberg, right, 5% of it's on top and then 95% of it is under the water. All of that under the water are all of those decisions that, that you've made from a configuration perspective, a training perspective, a HR security perspective, how you hire, what kind of background checks you make for individuals. So, information security, it's an all-encompassing, it's an all-encompassing thing here that doesn't necessarily depend upon one single tool or one single technology. But if you have the budget, go for it.
Right, that's the key, right? If you have the budget, as Jake said, go with NDR and EDR. Quincy, SOC teams rely heavily on the MITRE framework. MITRE attack framework has been instrumental to a lot of security teams, and that's the framework is being used for analyzing cyber attacks. How do NDR, EDR solutions help with incident management?
So NDR and EDR solutions help with incident management by stitching together the events that will create an incident. So let's kind of back that up a little bit. An event is just something that occurs on a system or in a network. An incident is known malicious behavior. So events are normal, but if you stitch together a couple of different events or many different events together, and you see that it's anomalous or it's bad in some way, then that turns into an incident. An incident is something that needs to be acted upon, and an event is something that occurs or usually occurs naturally in an IT environment. So how do NDR and EDR solutions help? Well, as I was saying before, they stitch together all of these events and create a picture of, or let's call it a movie, whereas an individual system is just a picture of what is happening. So it stitches together these different pictures that tends to occur sequentially, one after another in an environment to create a movie on what's exactly happening in an environment. And then you can zoom in to exactly what's happening on X system at X time, and then zoom out to look at all of the systems that are involved in a particular incident. Some EDR solutions will integrate with ticketing systems, NDR as well. They'll also integrate with SOAR systems. Those are automation tools that allow for scripts and automated actions. So what you can do is utilize the logs, the alerts, the events and incidents that might be collected by these NDR and EDR platforms to create a service now, or to create a ticket for your favorite vendor that deals with ticketing, to possibly shoot that over to some sort of SOAR technology, security automation, security orchestration, automation, and response software. And then you can create reports from there. And then ultimately, you can remediate and recover from whatever it is that happened on your network, in your cloud environment, or on your endpoints. So essentially, SOC teams do take a look at the MITRE attack framework for the different threats that are out there. And a lot of the network detection and response and EDR software that resides out there is actually based upon the MITRE attack framework. So the detections, the alerts, and the remediation is in line with the MITRE attack framework, because those are the most popular and most prevalent attack types, whether they're tactics, techniques, and procedures that attackers, hackers, and other individuals might try to use in order to break into or compromise an environment. So to put it succinctly, they speed up your response and they speed up the remediation associated with an incident.
Great. I was just going to add that, when you said stitch together, there's also a forensic component that we have to come back after the fact where they're really helpful, right? And you can replay events in a lot of these EDR and NDR platforms, which gives you a certain amount of information about the anatomy of a particular attack. and may even tell you more about the attack vector, which is helpful even if it in the post-mortem, because when we work with our intelligence partners, for example, we can give that information to them, and then they can use that to kind of help better inform other potential victims of these type of events. So I mean, they're very useful tools to SOC. I think I would have just said yes. I think the previous answer was better. Yes, they help, but they are very useful tools, and I do think that they have caused. If you want to know the effectiveness of the tool and incident response, look at how the adversary has responded and the links that they go through now to try to get around these tools. That tells you that they work, because they try to spend more time getting around them than trying to defeat them. And that's a good sign, actually, for the technology.
I think, Quincy, you did a great job in explaining kind of what NDR does and how it pulls it all together. But, to Victor's point about how it specifically aligns with MITRE, the one thing that I think this solution does very well, and I have to caveat this before I say anything, it does depend on your architecture and instrumentation. That is critical here. If you have an environment that has evolved to remote users and multiple SaaS providers and all of these other things that are pushing the boundaries of what we consider traditional infrastructure, and you still have your NDR solution simply reading or feeding off your core switch, then you are every single day that visibility that you have is shrinking as more things go beyond your traditional enterprise. So as you think about the MITRE framework and you look at things like privilege escalation or credential access, for instance, just taking this two, if you're not getting user data, for instance, if you're not getting data from your endpoints, if you're not integrating with your IAM solution, for instance, you're not going to fill out all those Lego bricks that make up the overall sort of MITRE framework. So you're going to be losing very important information. So cannot stress it enough. You've got to make sure that your instrumentation of these tools, the way you implement it, truly reflects the way your infrastructure has evolved, so that you get total visibility. Otherwise, you have a lot of the tooling, but you don't get full advantage from it. But the other thing to mention is a lot of these NDR vendors have the response capabilities, which we touched on early on. They're largely split into two groups. You have autonomous response or automated response, or you have a sort of scripted response, which is more building out playbooks. Well, whatever the case is, let's start with the latter. If you're looking at playbooks, you do have to build the playbooks. You do have to integrate it with SOAR technology, which then says, if this happens, I'm going to take these series of pre-validated actions. Or you do need to turn on autonomous response. So the system, you're trusting the system to respond to those events. Now, if you want to do that, there's a level of trust that you need to build up over time, so that you are confident that you're going to have a very precise approach, and the tool doesn't suddenly turn off your entire, turn off your network, for instance, or block traffic coming from one of your main providers because it had a false positive. So there is still some work for the human analyst to do here, building playbooks or tuning the system, reducing the false positives, so you get to the point where you can actually hands off control and let the autopilot engage, if you like. And if you don't do that, then ultimately you are not taking advantage of the response capability. And that's what gets you out of trouble. That's what lets you sleep better at night, not knowing that if you had a problem that you were covered, rather than coming in, and this has happened to all of us, rather than coming in the next day, you have an incident, then you go through the logs and go, well, actually my tools did pick it up, but it picked it up at 2 o'clock in the morning when there was no one looking at the dashboard, which is no use to keeping you out of the headline.
Maybe to your point, right? We spend a lot of hours and talk about artificial intelligence and machine learning and how humans need to start trusting it. If you have the solution, to your point, we need to put trust into it. So how would you rate the importance of AI, ML among these solutions to provide time to value for an investment?
Well, I think the importance of AI and ML cannot be overstated. It's essentially what makes this market different from what we've had before, which is almost responding to signature-based or some type of pattern detection, if you like, the ability to deal with zero-day detection and to respond to zero-day detection. The only way you can really do that effectively at the speed and the rate of change is if you have some ability to use artificial intelligence, deep learning, and this is where different vendors gravitate towards certain buzzwords. But whatever you choose to call it, is the ability to study on the fly what's going on. I think Jake put this really well at the start of our conversation here. The components that make up a lot of these malware are essentially the same. People repackage them, people string them together, use them for slightly different things, but ultimately you need the ability to do a number of things here. First of all, you want to be able to fingerprint anything that has happened, anything that has shown up in the wild before. And if it shows up again under a different guise, you still want the ability to detect it. You want to also see the threats, the tactics, the procedures that adversaries use, and being able to study this over time. And again, even if things look benign, if things don't look malicious on the face of it, you start piecing things together and stitching things together, and then you start seeing a pattern forming. There are other AI models that simply just detect what's abnormal. So they don't spend too much time looking at all the attack vectors and the attackers and IOCs. Instead, they focus on what is normal. What does a normal operation look like for an executive? What does a normal operation look like for someone in finance, someone in IT? And anything that is outside of that, then we're going to flag, and we will, with some degree of certainty, either take action or alert the human analyst to respond to that. So there's so many ways that we can use AI. The one thing that AI gives you, or whatever we choose to call this deep learning, is that it gives you speed, it gives you consistency, it gives you the reliability, and it's able to baseline and learn and build on that baseline. And that's something that humans do, but not consistently well enough. And so the importance that AI brings to this space is it really just significantly improves our efficacy, our speed of detection, the consistency of detection, and just giving all of us as folks in security leadership the assurance that we're not relying on our best analysts having their best day to respond to an incident that we're having to deal with.
Well, to add to that, one thing that machines do way better than humans is pattern recognition, right? And one of the things that I think that it can't be stressed at how important that is in day-to-day operations. And so these tools are really great at learning what your network normally does. It gets a pulse for your enterprise and for general activity that your users do. So when something is out of the ordinary, that's the important thing, because an analyst probably isn't. That's what I really want to stress. Even on their best day, an analyst probably isn't going to detect that right away, where these tools will, because they're going to kind of look at the day-to-day norms and come back and say, yeah, that's not right. That doesn't normally happen. That person never accesses a file that contains passwords. Today, that person's accessing a file that contains passwords. And so it's really interesting how well they work at that, but they also get it wrong. And I do want to say that we can't completely rely on the tool 100% without human intervention, because humans still have to validate the responses. I've seen where these tools do block legitimate code because it's either poorly written, it's a legacy application, et cetera, et cetera. We can't take the human analyst element out of kind of checking the AI to make sure that it is detecting and providing valid responses, which the more we do that and the more we validate that, the more it improves that efficacy from the tools.
And to add to that, I would really rate the importance of AI and ML. If I had to do it out of 10, I would say it's about a 4 right now, because I'm a big proponent of just baseline security controls that companies need to put in before they get to, an AI or ML type tool. I think AI and ML, that's where we're going, but there's a bit of a misnomer sometimes with the marketing with regard to these tools when they're actually just doing statistical analysis and they're not using machine learning algorithms or AI algorithms in order to further along the efficacy of the detection in their tools. So when we look at providing time to value for an investment, I think the biggest bang for your buck might not be the AI and ML tools that that we're looking at, although they're very very exciting, kind of flashy, but it's very helpful, but it tends to be a small piece of the tools that are presented to us. The AI and ML components are usually pushed up front, but the crux, the most important part of these systems tend to use a lot of static rules. At least that's what I've seen in the market. So it is important. It's growing in importance, and AI and ML will eventually take over, and will probably provide most of the decision making actions and response actions in the future. But I don't think we're there yet.
Valid point. I think no one will argue that. Let's wrap this session with our last question. Jake, what would you advise your fellow security leaders if someone is starting to explore this space of NDR, EDR, XDR, MDR, you name it? They're barely starting it. What would you advise them?
Well, I would say is the first thing is you have to go into understanding that there is a financial investment that's a little bit heftier than your traditional endpoint protection. And so you definitely want to weigh out those costs. And I'd say first and foremost, do a real value comparison. Because some of these EDR capabilities are built into other cloud suites that give you more capabilities. And I'm not going to advertise a product or discuss that. But there are products on the market that have essentially EDR capabilities with their extended licensing for other products to give you more functionality. So I'd say do your homework. That's the first thing I'd say is do your homework, make sure you're getting a value proposition. Because if you can get IT excited about it and they want to push it, then you're going to get support getting your EDR product or NDR product deployed. The other thing is I'd say weigh out how your architecture is laid out, what your goals are for the organization, for how your employees are going to work and live. Because you want to make sure that you are not investing in something that's only going to get marginal use at best. So you want to make sure that you're paying attention to that. But the last thing I would say is, you have to ask yourself, and this is something that they taught us when I was an officer in the Army, is you'd go in to brief your commander and he'd ask you, so what? And so I would start, so all of the stuff you'd put together, you had to be able to answer that one question, so what? And I would say that the so what for these EDR technologies or NDR technology, which you're looking at purchasing, is at the end of the day, when you buy it, can you deal with the information that it's going to give you? Do you have an ability to respond to the information that you're going to get from the system? Do you have the capabilities to manage it? Because all of those things are important. People want them because they do sound a little bit silver bullet-ish because of what they do, and the marketing literature around a lot of these tools is very silver bullet-ish. But you have to look at, do you have an ability to handle the information it's going to give you? Do you have the expertise and staff to connect those dots when you do get into the console and you start looking at the information that's coming back to you from that? I have a few analysts that look at this information when we manage our deployed products at work, and it does take a fair amount of their time to go through this and constantly update what's legit and and validating that the detections that it has that are malicious in nature are in fact valid, and accepting those as is. That takes a fair amount of time. And then you want to look at, if you don't have that capability, then do you want to look, a lot of these offerings are starting to extend to where they actually will do the partner response capabilities as almost like a managed service. And so you may want to even consider that option. But again, it comes down to kind of analyzing your risk. If you feel that you have this big risk of exposure, I would say, I agree. You have to kind of look at your basics. If you have a risk of exposure because you're worried about somebody getting control of one of your workstations, start looking at, what kind of risk mitigation you can put into place in there, and then see if there's that cost benefit there to put the money towards this. If the risk is high enough, and in the world that I'm in, I believe the stakes are pretty high, so I think the value proposition is there, then you respond accordingly, and you go out to purchase, and you do some due diligence and figure out which product's best going to fit your environment. But that's the advice I would give, is really just kind of answering that. So what can you do it? You can buy the product, but if you don't fully utilize it, it's pretty much essentially going to be deployed shelfware, and you won't get a lot out of it. So if you're not going to give it the time and attention that it deserves, because it is a great enhancement to your capabilities, then you may want to consider either a managed service in conjunction with one of the products, or even possibly a managed service where you're doing a XDR type approach all the way across your enterprise, because then you can kind of take that out of house and deflect some of that risk to a third party.
Maybe I know you have NDR, EDR experience, and you have scars as well. So if you would have to advise someone and maybe you get a chance to do it all over again, what would you do at this time?
Yeah, I think the points that Jake and Quincy made is so important. I would just very quickly re-echo three things. The first is architecture. Super, right? Our infrastructure is changing. Can't stress it enough. Make sure that you are instrumenting your tools to reflect your modern architecture, or that the tools will grow with your architecture. That's the first thing. The second thing is that a lot of the vendors, a lot of the tools we have today, from next-gen firewalls to next-gen AV products, a lot of them do have some ability to do what we are loosely classing as an NDR solution. So look to those tools, and perhaps you can extract logs from those. Most NDR tools would allow you to feed in some of the logs from other solutions. So that gives you a true single point to review. The third thing is, a lot of these tools have a ton of features that we eventually don't use. So just make sure that you are actually using a lot of the feature set, as obviously you need to grow that trust, as we discussed earlier. And then the last thing that I would add additional to those three is have some type of checks and balances. And what I mean by that is, don't buy tools like this and simply offload them to the operations teams to work with day to day. The vendors that I work with, one of the very first things that I look for when we're looking at buying, especially operations tools, is I ask for, what's that executive level dashboard like? What is that CISA dashboard like, if you like? What is the enterprise view like? All right, and so I want a tool that gives me that view, whatever that is. That may actually be a PDF, a PowerPoint report that I get, a notification, a weekly summary, something that bubbles things up. Because as you get busier, I don't go into the tools, into the dashboards every single day. But my team know that every now and again, I'm going to read through one of the reports, and I will flag something and say, hey, give me an update on this one event, this IRC, this threat, this event that happened a week ago or happened yesterday. What exactly did we do? And just that really simple interaction puts the teams, they know that, hey, we've got to be using these tools, because I never know when he's going to come asking me some question that I don't have the answer to. So think about that, and think about how you, as ultimately the risk, the executive or the risk custodian, depending on how your structure within your organization, just make sure you have visibility that gives you some clear traction with what's going on. It keeps your teams on their toes, it keeps everyone honest, and it keeps everyone actually using the tool. Otherwise, it just becomes a shiny toy, and then they move on to the next exciting thing within their toolkit.
Wow, I think you gentlemen put it very well. Common theme that I understood there was, you have a rule: no paperweights allowed, right? If you're going to purchase some technology, you've got to use it. If you're going to avoid having a paperweight in your environment, you've got to answer the question, what problem does this solve for in my environment? And then work your way forward, right? You don't want to start with, hey, I just got this great marketing email or phone call, or I attended this great event, and they told me about all of this wonderful AI, ML, and it's going to, like Jake put it, it's going to be a silver bullet, right? There are no silver bullets in information security, save for patching your environment, and even then, there are 0 days that have yet to be disclosed. So no paperweights. Make a laser beam effort to ensure that you do not have a paperweight for a system in your environment. It wastes money, it wastes time and effort in implementing, and generally it will decrease your effectiveness as you are paying attention to a system that doesn't need to be in your environment. Next thing is make sure and have a long POC. I've noticed that a lot of vendors tend to decrease the amount of time to a ridiculous time frame to review a system, and that typically is the number of days that it takes to actually just get yourself familiar with the console. So whenever you're going to take a look at any of these different types of systems, no matter what system it is, do a long POC. Think of 2 months or even longer, if possible, rather than a 14-day POC, because typically that's just not enough time. Additionally, a penetration test during the time that you're POCing could be a good idea. I mean, why not try to test this system with some live fire type activity from a real threat actor in your environment in a red team scenario. Next tip is understand the tech. So, they're going to come at you with AI, ML, and all types of other acronyms. But you've got to ask the question, okay, how does this work? What does this mean? And if the other person on the end of that call or that meeting can't explain exactly how the technology works, I think you have your answer, whether or not you should look more closely into that technology or not. You've got to test it thoroughly. You've got to make sure that this tool that you're going to buy, or these tools, are going to integrate with what you currently have. I think Nemi mentioned that earlier. It's very important to integrate all of your tools together to create that picture, that movie of what exactly is happening in your environment, so that you can respond accordingly. And then my last tip here is you have to understand that there is a time investment, there's a personnel investment, there's a financial investment in any solution that you're going to install in your environment. This is not a set it and forget it type of system, whether you're looking at EDR, NDR, or any security technology. Every single technology that we have in our environment is going to require updating. It's going to come out with new features and functionality. It might be displaced by another technology in the environment. So, be forward-looking. Understand that you have to take a look at what's going to happen in the future, and then dial it back to what you're doing today, and make sure that this plan that you're making and this technology that you want to bring in, you have the personnel, you have the time, and it makes sense for your environment. And that's it. Those are the tips that I have.
Well, that's a wrap. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being the panelist. And I think this has been a great conversation about NDR, EDR, and how to leverage. We also talked about the history. So once again, thank you so much.
Thanks, Victor. Thanks, gents.
Thank you. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Victor.